Last year, I decided to take a solo road trip to visit some old college friends. They had moved to a small town up north after graduation, and though we hadn't been in touch as much lately, every summer I made it a point to visit. It was a tradition I cherished, one that kept our bond strong despite the distance. Usually, I flew out, but this time I wanted to take a different approach. I'd drive. I'd never seen the countryside in that part of the country, and the thought of discovering hidden gems along the way was too tempting to resist. I packed my car the night before, loaded up on snacks, and left early the next morning, excited to take my time and explore. The first few days were easy, just driving and taking in the sights. I made several stops, checked out old landmarks, museums, and parks I'd read about. It was nothing out of the ordinary. Just me, the open road, and the gentle hum of the car's engine. The journey felt long, but pleasant. By the third day, I expected to be closing in on my destination, but something felt off. It was around 9:30 p.m. when I found myself still driving on a stretch of highway I didn't recognize. The road was desolate, the darkness stretching far beyond what my headlights could cut through. No other cars in sight. It was oddly quiet, and the stillness seemed to weigh heavily on me. I began to feel the effects of the long hours behind the wheel. My eyelids felt heavy and my back ached from sitting in the same position for so long. I needed a break, a coffee to keep me going. I decided to stop at the next rest stop. The exit was unremarkable. A small, dimly lit building sat off to the side, surrounded by a handful of empty parking spaces. I pulled in and parked near the entrance, stretching my legs as I made my way toward the building. The air was thick with humidity, and the faint scent of gasoline lingered from the nearby pumps. The flickering lights of the rest stop felt like a strange beacon in the otherwise empty world. Inside, the space was sparsely furnished: vending machines, a few magazines, and the usual public restroom. The soft buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound, a constant hum that felt oddly oppressive in the silence. I wandered over to the vending machine, my eyes scanning the rows of snacks, when I noticed the sound of a car pulling into the lot behind me. At first, I thought nothing of it, but then I noticed the car wasn't just parking in any open spotlet pulled in directly next to mine. The thought crossed my mind, with all the empty spaces, why park so close? I tried not to think too much about it. It wasn't a big deal. But then, I saw something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I walked into the restroom, did what I needed to do, and when I returned, the car was still there, its lights on. I glanced at it as I took a slow sip from the Red Bull I'd bought, trying to shake off the creeping unease that had started to grow in me. It was then that I noticed something strange. The engine had been running the whole time I was inside. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Something about that car, parked so close, with no one getting out, was wrong. My gaze shifted back to the car as I tried to make my way out of the building, my mind racing. Just as I neared the door, I heard the engine cut off. Then, the driver's door opened. A tall man stepped out, his silhouette casting a long shadow in the dim light. He wore a brown leather jacket, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets. My body froze, a strange tension filling the air around me. Something about the way he moved, slow and deliberate, made me uneasy. I could feel my heart racing as he started walking toward me, his gaze never leaving me. His eyes cold, calculating, sent a wave of fear through my body. I quickly turned and started walking toward my car, hoping to avoid confrontation. But as I passed him, I couldn't help but acknowledge him with a quick nod. He did the same. But then, just as I thought I'd made it, I heard a low, menacing, "Hey." I turned around, only to find myself face to face with the barrel of a gun. The air in the rest stop felt thick, almost heavy, as if it was holding its breath. It was late, too late. The quietness of the place should have been peaceful, but instead, it seemed wrong. I hadn't even noticed it at first, the unease that had been growing in my gut. At first, I was just relieved to be out of the car, to stretch my legs after hours of driving. But the stillness, the silence that surrounded me, it was like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something. The building, though small and modest, stood alone in the dark, casting long shadows under the weak glow of the overhead lights. The vending machines hummed softly in the background, and the only sounds were the distant rustling of leaves and the faint hum of the highway far off. I had parked my car, gotten out, and walked slowly toward the door. The building had only a few cars scattered around, but the one that parked right next to mine made me pause. It wasn't that I cared where people parked, maybe it was just coincidence, but it was odd, considering there were plenty of other open spaces. I tried not to think too much of it. Maybe it was nothing, but deep down, I had a feeling that something wasn't quite right. Inside, the lights flickered above me, casting strange, uneven shadows on the floor. The air inside the building smelled faintly of stale coffee and cleaning supplies, and there was the faintest sound of someone cleaning a floor somewhere in the distance. The bathroom was just down the hall, with a janitor's closet on one side and a few vending machines lining the wall on the other. I stood in front of the vending machines for a while, eyeing the selection. A Red Bull caught my attention. I hadn't been drinking much coffee, and the tiredness was starting to hit me. I grabbed the can, popped it open, and drank. As I stood there, sipping the drink, I glanced toward the window again. The car that had parked next to mine was still there. The headlights were on, and I could see the faint outline of someone sitting in the driver's seat, motionless. I had no reason to be worried people sat in their cars all the time, but there was something unsettling about the way this person sat. Not a single movement. Not even the normal fidgeting that people usually do when waiting. I looked away, shaking off the unease. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe they were just tired too. But the feeling wouldn't go away. I finished my drink and made my way toward the bathroom. I didn't take long, just 5 minutes or so. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. It was probably just my imagination, but it felt real. When I came out, the car was still there, and the driver's side door was open. At first, I didn't think much of it. It could be anyone. But then something about the way the man stepped out caught my attention. He was taller than me, with a beard that made him look rough. His brown leather jacket creaked as he moved, and his boots hit the ground with a dull thud. It wasn't just his appearance that stood out. It was the way he moved. Slow, deliberate, almost like he was in no rush. And then there were his eyes. Those eyes, they were cold, unblinking. They didn't seem to focus on anything in particular, but when they found me, they didn't leave. It was like he was studying me, trying to figure me out. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me even though I had turned back toward the vending machine. He started walking toward me, and my body tensed instinctively. I knew it was irrational, but every part of me screamed that I should leave, get back to the car, and drive away. But I didn't. I stayed frozen, my feet rooted to the floor. There was something about him, something off, but I didn't know what. I wanted to say something, to ask if he needed help, but my throat felt tight. I couldn't speak. As he got closer, I moved instinctively, taking a few steps back, but not too fast. I tried to look calm. I nodded at him when we crossed paths, offering a simple greeting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't interested in a friendly chat. "Hey," he called out to me, his voice low, barely more than a murmur in the still night air. I turned back around, meeting his eyes once again. He was standing still now, just a few feet away from me. The words I wanted to say were stuck in my chest, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. My mind was racing. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual, though I could feel the tension in my voice. He didn't immediately respond. Instead, he took a slow step toward me, his boots dragging against the gravel. It was so quiet, too quiet. I could hear every movement he made, every shift of his weight. I felt his presence like a weight pressing down on my chest. "You're not from around here, are you?" His voice was deep, and it felt like it echoed inside my head, even though he was speaking softly. "No," I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm just passing through." His eyes narrowed slightly, and he took another step forward, closer now. I didn't move. There was no way I could. "Not now. You should be careful," he said, his tone shifting to something darker. "You don't know what you've walked into." The words hit me like a cold wave, but I couldn't make sense of them. My mind was trying to catch up, but it wasn't fast enough. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice shaking a little despite my best efforts. I wanted to ask more questions, to get some kind of explanation, but something told me that the answers I was looking for were not the kind I wanted to hear. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, like he was sizing me up. And for a moment, just a fleeting second, I saw something shift in his eyes. Something dark. Something that made my blood run cold. I felt a sudden urge to leave. I couldn't explain why, but I had to get away from him. The unease that had been simmering since I first stepped into the rest stop was now bubbling over, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. Before I could make a move, I heard a noise. It was faint, like the sound of a twig snapping in the distance. I turned toward the sound. There, just on the edge of the parking lot, was a figure, standing still. Watching the figure at the edge of the parking lot stood motionless, cloaked in the darkness. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, my eyes playing games with me. But no, there was something there, something solid, standing in the shadows just beyond the parking lot. I couldn't make out any features, but the shape of the figure was unmistakable. It was human, but it didn't move like one. I felt my heart skip a beat, and I instinctively took a step back, my eyes darting from the man with the gun to the figure in the dark. The man in front of me seemed to sense my discomfort, his gaze shifting briefly in the direction of the shadow, before returning to me. He didn't seem worried, but there was a flicker of something strange in his eyes. "Do you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The man didn't answer right away, but I saw the slight curve of his lips, almost as if he were amused by my fear. "You're not the first," he said, his voice calm but cold, "and you won't be the last." What did he mean by that? His words didn't make sense, and my mind struggled to keep up with everything that was happening. The figure in the shadows was still there, unmoving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching us. Or rather, watching me. I glanced back at the man with the gun, trying to steady my breath. "Who is that?" asked, the words slipping out before I could stop them. His smile deepened, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was cruel. "Someone who doesn't want you here." That feeling in my stomach deepened, and the air around me grew heavier. I wanted to ask more questions, to demand answers, but I knew that whatever I said wouldn't change anything. The man wasn't here to help me. He was here for a reason, one I still didn't understand. A cold wind blew through the rest stop, and I shivered. It wasn't just the temperature. It was the atmosphere itself that had changed. The place no longer felt like a simple rest stop. It felt like a trap, and I was the one caught in it. I forced myself to take a deep breath, to stay calm. I tried to ignore the figure, but it was impossible. Every time I looked away, I could feel it pulling my gaze back. There was something wrong about that figure, something off that I couldn't quite place. "What do you want from?" finally asked, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and frustration. The man didn't answer immediately. He just kept his eyes locked on mine, and it felt like he was searching my soul, looking for something hidden. "You're here for a reason," he said slowly. "People don't end up here by accident." A shiver ran down my spine. I didn't want to know what he meant by that, but I couldn't stop myself from asking. What reason? The man didn't answer right away. He seemed to consider my question, and for a moment, there was a strange stillness in the air. He wasn't moving, but neither was I. The tension between us thickened, and I could hear the faint sound of the wind rustling the trees in the distance. And then, just as I was about to ask again, I heard it. A sound, low, deep, and unnatural. It came from behind the building, just out of sight. It was like the sound of something scraping against the ground, something heavy. I froze. The man didn't move, but his gaze flicked briefly toward the source of the sound. He didn't seem surprised. In fact, he almost seemed relieved. "You hear that?" I asked, my heart pounding harder now. He nodded, a hint of something almost like satisfaction in his eyes. "It's them. They're coming." I didn't know who they were, but I didn't want to find out. My instinct screamed at me to get in my car and drive away, to leave before it was too late. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, my feet glued to the ground as I struggled to make sense of everything that was happening. And then, I heard it again. This time, louder, closer, like something or someone was getting closer. I turned to look, but the figure in the shadows was gone. I couldn't see it anymore. Panic surged inside me. Where had it gone? Why had it disappeared? Before I could process what was happening, the man with the gun spoke again, his voice low and deliberate. "It's too late to run now." A chill ran through me. I didn't know what he meant by that, but the sense of danger around me intensified. The air felt thick, suffocating. Every nerve in my body screamed that something was coming, something terrible. I turned toward my car, my body moving before I could even think. The cold sweat on my forehead was sticky, and I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I stumbled forward, my legs shaky. I had to get out of here. I had to go. But the man's voice stopped me dead in my tracks. "You can't leave," he said, his tone suddenly cold, almost final. "Not until it's done." My body froze. The words echoed in my mind, repeating over and over. "Not until it's done." My feet wouldn't move. I couldn't run. I couldn't speak. The world seemed to close in on me, and all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat, the rush of blood in my ears, drowning out the other sounds that were growing louder. The scrape of something moving against the ground, the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. It all felt closer now, as if something or someone was slowly circling, getting nearer. I turned back to the man, but he wasn't looking at me anymore. His eyes were fixed on something in the distance, his expression unreadable. His hand was still in his jacket pocket, and the grip of the gun was probably tighter now. My breath caught in my throat. "What's happening?" finally managed to ask, my voice breaking as I did. He didn't respond at first. His gaze remained distant, focused on whatever was out there. The air around me felt heavier, as if I was suffocating, and the cold wind that had been blowing before seemed to have stopped. Everything was still now. Then, without warning, the silence was shattered. A loud crash came from the far side of the building, followed by the unmistakable sound of something or someone rushing through the underbrush. The noise was chaotic, unnatural. It sounded almost like an animal, but the sound was too human, too deliberate. My stomach dropped. Something was out there, and it was coming closer. The man finally looked at me, his eyes now sharp, focused, and there was something in them that sent a jolt of terror straight through my veins. "It's time." I wanted to run. I wanted to get back in my car, speed away, and never looked back. But my feet felt like lead, rooted to the spot. My legs were shaking, and my thoughts were racing, spinning in a whirlwind of confusion and fear. What was he talking about? What was going on here? I don't understand, I whispered, barely able to find my voice. What do you mean, it's time? He stepped closer to me, and I instinctively took a step back. But he didn't seem to care. His gaze was unrelenting, and I could feel his presence pressing down on me like a weight. You're not the first, he said again, this time more firmly. And you won't be the last. They always come. Always. I couldn't understand what he meant. Who was coming? What was happening? The fear in my chest was almost suffocating, and my mind was struggling to catch up. But I couldn't make sense of anything. Before I could ask another question, the crash of branches snapping filled the air again, and this time, I could hear heavy footsteps that weren't human, or at least not entirely human. The sound was too deep, too heavy, like something much larger than any person could be. I glanced back over my shoulder, and that's when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, just at the edge of the tree line, I saw something move. A shadow, impossibly tall and wide, like the shape of a man but stretched, distorted. It wasn't walking, it was more like gliding. My breath caught in my throat. That was no person. The man with the gun didn't look at me. He didn't even flinch. He seemed ready, as though he had seen this before. But for me, I was paralyzed with fear. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My body felt like it was turning to stone. I turned back to the man, panic in my eyes. What is that? I managed to choke out, barely able to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His expression said it all. A sudden, piercing screech cut through the air, loud and shrill, enough to make my blood run cold. It came from the thing in the darkness. And that sound, it was a warning, a signal. I don't know why, but I knew. It wasn't just making noise. It was calling. It was getting closer. And in that moment, I knew it was no longer a question of whether I could leave. I couldn't. I was trapped here, stuck in a place I didn't understand, with people and things I couldn't even begin to explain. I turned to the car again, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my keys. But as I started toward the car, the man stepped in front of me, blocking my way. No, he said, his voice like ice. It's too late for that. You can't run. Not now. Not when they've already found you. I felt a sickening weight in my chest as I stared at him, trying to process what he had just said. They had already found me. The words didn't make sense. How could I be found? I had just stopped to use the restroom. This couldn't be happening. But the deep, unnatural growl that filled the air told me it was. It was happening, and there was no escaping it. I looked past him again, my gaze drawn to the shadows. The figure, the thing, was closer now, the dark shape becoming clearer. It was tall, towering, its features hidden beneath a black cloak. But even from this distance, I could see the unnatural way it moved. Like it was gliding, like it wasn't even touching the ground. It wasn't just one. As the figure moved, others emerged, each one moving in a way that sent cold fear creeping up my spine. And then I understood. They weren't human. Not anymore. I didn't know what they were, but the chill that ran through me told me that I didn't want to find out. The figure in the shadows moved closer, its shape becoming clearer with each passing second. It wasn't just tall, it was massive. It was like the trees themselves had bent and twisted into a human shape. I could barely breathe, my heart hammering in my chest as I stood frozen, staring at the creature. The air was thick with fear. I tried to convince myself that this couldn't be happening, but the growl that rumbled from deep within the creature told me it was real. It wasn't some trick of the mind. It wasn't just the wind or the shadows playing tricks. The man with the gun didn't flinch. His eyes were focused on the approaching shape, like he knew exactly what was coming. He didn't move. He didn't say a word. It was as though he had seen this before, and he wasn't scared. Maybe he didn't even care. The only thing that seemed to matter to him was that I didn't escape. I wanted to scream, but my voice got stuck in my throat. I wanted to run, to jump in my car and drive as far away as I could, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. Every part of my body was telling me to run, but I couldn't. I was stuck in this nightmare, and the longer I stood there, the closer the shadowy figure came. Then, just as I thought I might collapse, I saw another figure. It was smaller than the first one, but it was just as wrong. It didn't walk like a person. It didn't move in the way anything alive should. It skittered across the ground, its arms and legs bending at odd angles, its head turning unnaturally in all directions. My stomach twisted, and I almost gagged. The way it moved made me sick to my core. It was like something that shouldn't exist, something born from the darkest corners of the earth. I took a step back, my body trembling uncontrollably. My hand reached for my car keys, but before I could grab them, the man stepped forward, blocking my path again. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice calm, almost too calm, given the situation. I didn't understand. Why was he stopping me? Why didn't he seem scared? "You don't get it, He looked at me like I was the one who was out of place. "They've been waiting for you." I felt a chill run down my spine. Waiting for me, what did he mean by that? The confusion in my mind only made the fear grow. Who were they, or what was going on, and why did this man seem so resigned? Just then, I heard another noise. Something was rustling in the trees behind me. Slowly, I turned my head, dread filling every corner of my mind. And there it was, more shadows, more figures, moving in perfect silence. They were closing in from all sides. My pulse quickened. My mind screamed at me to do something, anything, to escape. But there was no escape. "Run," the man said, his voice suddenly urgent. It caught me off guard. Run now. I didn't need another warning. My body acted before my brain could catch up. I bolted for the car, my heart pounding in my chest. But I only made it a few feet before something cold and sharp brushed against my shoulder. I yelped, stumbling forward, and turned to see what had grabbed me. It wasn't the man with the gun. It was one of them. A pale, twisted figure with long fingers, reaching for me like it was trying to pull me into the darkness. The thing's face was a mask of malice, its eyes glowing with a faint yellow light. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. I reached for my car door, but the lock wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me as I frantically tried to open it. "Get in," the man shouted. But it was too late. I could feel the thing's cold breath against my neck, its fingers tightening around my arm, dragging me back into the shadows. I kicked and struggled, but it was like trying to fight against a wall. The thing was too strong. With one last desperate scream, I yanked my arm free and dove into the car, slamming the door shut behind me. I could hear the scraping noise of claws against the metal, like the thing was trying to tear its way inside. My hands were shaking so badly I almost couldn't start the engine. But somehow, I managed. I threw the car into drive, my foot pressing down on the gas, and the engine roared to life. The sound of my tires screeching against the road was the only thing I could hear as I sped away, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror, couldn't afford to. Every second I was driving, I felt like something was chasing me, watching me, getting closer. I could still feel that thing's cold fingers digging into my arm, its icy touch lingering like a brand. The memory of its eyes, glowing faintly in the dark, haunted me. My heart raced in my chest, and my thoughts were a blur. What had I just seen? What were those things, and why had that man stopped me from escaping? The road ahead seemed endless. I had no idea where I was anymore. My phone had no signal. The lights of civilization felt like a distant dream. Everything around me was just a void blackness on all sides, with only the faint glow of my headlights illuminating the path ahead. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare that had no end. Every time I tried to push the panic down, it rose again, choking me. I wasn't just running from those creatures. I was running from something bigger, something I didn't understand. I could still hear their movement in my mind, the soft whispers, the unnatural scraping of claws, the sounds of something large and unholy creeping closer. I could feel them, just beyond the trees, as though they were lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. I didn't know how much longer I could keep driving. My eyes were heavy with exhaustion, my body aching from the tension. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't give in to the fear. Every instinct in me screamed to keep going. I didn't know if they could track me, but I wasn't about to take any chances. Then, as if the night had heard my thoughts, the car's headlights flickered. The engine sputtered, and for a brief, horrifying moment, it seemed like the car was going to stall. I slammed my foot down on the accelerator, praying the car wouldn't break down in the middle of nowhere. The road was empty, no houses, no lights. It was just me and the darkness. I glanced at the dashboard, hoping to see something that could reassure me. But instead, my heart skipped a beat. The fuel gauge was almost empty. How had that happened? I had just filled up a few hours ago. Panic surged through me. I wasn't anywhere near a gas station. I was completely alone on a dark, deserted highway. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow moving on the edge of the road. I blinked, thinking it was just a trick of the light, but then it moved again quickly, and much closer this time. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a person. It was something else, something that didn't belong. It was too fast, too unnatural. I slammed my foot on the brakes, and the car skidded to a stop. My heart was pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. The figure was moving along the side of the road now, stepping in and out of the light, almost as though it was toying with me. I could barely make it out, but I could see enough to know it wasn't human. Its limbs were long and twisted, like they didn't bend right. It moved with a strange, jerking motion, like it was an insect trying to walk like a person. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The figure seemed to be getting closer, its movements erratic and unsettling. I forced myself to look away, focusing on the road ahead, hoping it would just disappear. But then, I heard a sound that froze me in place. A knock. It was soft at first, barely audible, but then it came again, this time, louder. It was coming from the passenger side window. I couldn't look. I couldn't bring myself to turn my head. What if it was one of those things? What if it had somehow gotten closer? I had to stay calm. I had to think. I slowly reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling. I didn't want to open the door. I didn't want to see what was on the other side. But I couldn't just sit there, paralyzed with fear. I had to do something. I had to act. Before I could reach it, the knocking came again, louder this time, like it was desperate. My whole body went cold. I finally looked, just for a second, just to see what was out there. There was nothing. The road was empty. I quickly locked the doors and hit the gas again, speeding down the highway with no real destination in mind. My hands were shaking so much that I could barely keep the wheel steady. Every noise I heard, the wind, the engine, even the tires on the pavement, sounded too loud, too unnatural. It felt like the world was closing in around me. I don't know how much time passed. It could have been minutes or hours. My eyes were starting to blur with fatigue, and the line between what was real and what wasn't was starting to blur. The darkness felt like it was swallowing me whole. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen another car on the road, or heard another human voice. I was alone, truly alone, and the fear was growing in my chest, suffocating me. And then, without warning, the car jerked violently, like something had slammed into the side. I nearly lost control, but somehow managed to keep the wheel steady. My heart was in my throat as I looked at the rearview mirror, expecting to see one of those creatures behind me. But there was nothing, not at first. Then, in the distance, I saw a pair of headlights. I thought it was another car at first. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that it was just another driver. But the headlights were too bright, too focused. They were coming at me fast, too fast. The car was driving in the opposite direction, right toward me, and it wasn't slowing down. I could feel my breath catch in my throat. Something wasn't right. The car wasn't swerving to avoid me. It wasn't trying to pass me. It was heading straight toward me, at full speed. My mind raced as I tried to think of something to do. I swerved to the side, barely avoiding a collision, but the car didn't pass me. It matched my every move, staying right on my tail, as if it knew exactly where I was going. The headlights were blinding now, filling the rearview mirror, and I could see nothing else. My heart raced as the sound of the engine grew louder, closer. It wasn't just following me, it was hunting me. I took a sharp turn, hoping to lose it, but the car followed, relentless, like it was attached to me. I sped down winding roads, over hills, through twists and turns, but it was always there, just behind me, never stopping. I glanced at the rearview mirror one last time, and for the first time, I saw the car clearly. It wasn't a car. It was something else. The headlights had no source. The car's body was distorted, twisted in ways that didn't make sense. It was like the shape was being pulled apart, stretched, then put back together in jagged, broken pieces. The windows were black, no reflection, no light inside. And the sound was not an engine. It was a low, guttural growl that seemed to shake the air itself. I could feel the terror seeping into my bones. There was no escape. The things that were hunting me, that had been waiting for me, they were closing in. The car was still behind me, its headlights blinding me with an unnatural intensity. My hands were slick with sweat as I gripped the steering wheel, my eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. I couldn't outrun it. No matter how fast I drove, it stayed with me, always just a few feet away. The growl of its engine wasn't an engine at all, it was more like the deep, throaty sound of some kind of beast, vibrating through the air. My heart pounded in my chest, almost as loud as the noise behind me. I didn't know what to do. The car, no, whatever it was, wasn't just following me. It was hunting me. I could feel it. It was a presence, something that wasn't human, something that wasn't even alive. My brain screamed at me to escape, to do something, but my body was frozen in place. Every time I looked back, I saw that terrifying shape, distorted and wrong, and it made my stomach turn. I slammed my foot down harder on the accelerator, the engine roaring, but the distance between us never grew. It was like the thing was attached to me, like it could sense my every move. I swerved around corners, taking turns so sharp that the tires screeched and the car almost lost control. But no matter what I did, it was still there, its shape twisted and flickering like something from a nightmare. I had to stop. I had to think, but I couldn't. My hands were shaking too badly to make a plan. I had no idea where I was, no idea if there was even a road to lead me out of this nightmare. The darkness around me was closing in. The headlights were too bright, too blinding, and I could barely see the road anymore. Every time I glanced at the rearview mirror, I could see its shadow getting bigger, like it was eating up the light, pulling everything into its darkness. Then, without warning, the thing in the rearview mirror sped up. I could hear its growl growing louder and louder, like it was getting closer, ready to tear me apart. My breath caught in my throat as I felt the terror rise inside me, a cold, suffocating feeling that wrapped around my chest. I couldn't outrun it anymore. It was going to catch me. The road ahead was a blur now. I couldn't see anything clearly, just the bright, blinding lights that filled my vision, and the terrible growling sound. I could feel my pulse in my neck, pounding so hard I thought it would burst. The fear was overwhelming, but somewhere deep inside, I knew I couldn't let it win. I couldn't let this thing take me. I had to fight back. I had to survive. I looked to my side, desperate for some kind of escape, but there was nothing. The trees were thick on both sides of the road, and the only thing ahead was more darkness. That was when I saw it. The bridge. I didn't know if it was safe. I didn't care. It was my only chance. Without thinking, I jerked the wheel hard to the right, sending the car skidding toward the narrow bridge. The tires screeched in protest, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I was going to lose control. But somehow, I made it. The car slid onto the bridge, and for the first time, I felt a tiny flicker of hope. Maybe the thing following me couldn't cross the bridge. Maybe I could finally escape. But just as that thought crossed my mind, I heard the growl again, closer this time, too close. I dared to glance in the rearview mirror, and there it was. The thing, the car. It was right behind me, so close I could see its twisted body rippling in the lights, its jagged edges scraping along the road. It was coming for me, faster than ever. The growl was louder, more insistent, like it was warning me. The bridge was narrow. I couldn't keep going at this speed. I had to slow down, but if I slowed down, I'd be an easy target. My heart was racing, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel harder. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My only thought was to get to the end of that bridge. I could hear the engineer, whatever that thing was behind me, pushing closer, threatening to crash into me. The growl was deafening now, like it was roaring, like it was going to swallow me whole. I felt a surge of panic, but I couldn't let it take me. I pushed the accelerator to the floor, the car speeding up, the tires screeching against the road. The bridge stretched out ahead, but it felt endless, like it would never end, like I was trapped in a loop that would never break. The growl got louder and louder, until it was all I could hear. It was right behind me now, and I could feel the heat of its presence pressing against me. Just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the bridge began to end. The road stretched out into the darkness ahead, and the car, the thing, was still on my tail. But then, something happened. The bridge ended. The road in front of me opened up to a vast field. And then, as if the car could no longer follow, it stopped. It halted, right at the edge of the bridge, and I could feel the weight of the moment settle over me. For the first time in what felt like forever, the growling stopped. The blinding lights behind me flickered and then disappeared, like the thing had been swallowed by the night. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I floored the gas pedal, speeding away into the dark, unsure if the thing was still behind me, unsure if it was truly gone. My heart was still pounding in my chest, my mind spinning with fear. But no matter what, I couldn't stop. I couldn't look back. I didn't know what that thing was. I didn't know why it had been chasing me. But I knew one thing for sure: wasn't going to let it win. I didn't look back. I kept my foot on the gas, my eyes locked straight ahead, and I drove as fast as I could, as far as I could, not knowing where I was going, but knowing that I would never stop running from whatever it was. My foot was pressed firmly on the gas pedal, my hands clutched tight to the wheel. My pulse was a heavy drumbeat in my chest, thundering so loudly that it drowned out everything else. I could still feel the terrifying growl echoing in my mind, the roar of that thing behind me. The dark road stretched out ahead, but no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, right behind me. I could feel it in my bones, that dreadful presence, like a weight pressing down on me, suffocating me. I glanced into the rearview mirror, heart pounding, my breath caught in my throat. The headlights, those blinding, cursed headlights, were gone, but the fear remained, crawling under my skin. It wasn't gone, I realized. The thing wasn't gone. It was still with me, but now it was in my mind. It was lingering in the darkness, waiting for me to make a mistake, waiting for me to break. The road ahead seemed endless, just a black ribbon of asphalt stretching out into the abyss. There were no other cars, no lights, nothing but the dark wilderness around me. I kept my eyes on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in, watching me, waiting. It was like I wasn't alone anymore, like I had become the prey. A sudden, sharp sound broke through the silence, and I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded, tires screeching, almost losing control. I managed to bring it to a stop just inches from the edge of the road. My breath was ragged, chest rising and falling as I tried to calm my racing heart. It was then that I noticed it. In the darkness, near the edge of the road, stood a figure, tall, cloaked in shadows, with no clear shape. Its presence was unnatural, standing still, as if it had been waiting for me all along. My eyes widened in terror. I couldn't make out its face, but I didn't need to. I could feel the evil in its stillness, the cold, malevolent energy that it radiated. I tried to start the car again, but the engine sputtered. Panic gripped me as I turned the key again and again, but it wouldn't start. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its shape flickering like a mirage. My hands were shaking as I reached for the door handle, my mind screaming at me to get out, to run, but my body was frozen. Something deep inside told me that leaving the car was just as dangerous as staying inside it. And then, as if it had read my mind, the figure started to move. Slowly at first, like a shadow stretching across the ground, it inched closer, step by agonizing step. I could see it more clearly now, its body long and unnatural, its movements jerky like it was shifting through different realities. It wasn't human. It wasn't even alive. I could feel its eyes on me, burning through the windshield, though it had no face, no features. A low whisper reached my ears, barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. It wasn't a voice, not in the traditional sense. It was more like a thought, a presence, a message in the back of my mind. You cannot escape. The words sent a chill through my body, a cold that cut through me like ice. My hands trembled violently as I gripped the wheel, turning it frantically, trying to get the car started. My fingers were numb, but I didn't care. I had to escape. The figure was closer now, almost at the edge of the car. I could feel the temperature drop as it neared. The night seemed to thicken, and a heavy fog began to roll in, swirling around the car in a suffocating mist. My breath fogged up the windshield, but it wasn't the cold air. No, this was something else. It was as if the fog was alive, thick and oppressive, pulling at my mind, clouding my thoughts. I turned the key one last time, and this time, the engine roared to life. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I slammed my foot down on the gas, I felt a tug at my chest, like something invisible was holding me back. The car lurched forward, but the road was getting narrower. The fog was thickening, and the trees on either side of the road seemed to reach out, their branches like skeletal hands trying to pull me into the darkness. I could feel the figure behind me, still watching, still following. No matter how fast I went, no matter how hard I pressed the gas, it was always there, in the shadows, just out of sight. I glanced in the rearview mirror again and saw nothing. But I knew it was still there. That feeling, that presence, was still with me. It was like a nightmare that refused to end. Suddenly, the headlights flickered. The car jerked again, and this time, I couldn't control it. The wheel spun out of my hands, and I found myself veering off the road, into the forest. My heart was in my throat as the car crashed through the trees, branches scraping across the windows. I fought to regain control, but it was like the road had turned against me. The fog seemed to grow thicker, and the forest closed in from all sides. And then, I heard it. The growl. The same deep, rumbling sound that had haunted me from the beginning. It was so close now, vibrating the air, filling my ears, making my skin crawl. I could feel it, right behind me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't see. I could only hear the growl, feel the pounding in my chest. My vision blurred as the fog swallowed the car whole. The trees were no longer there. The road was gone. It was just me, the car, and the endless, suffocating darkness. But then, the car slammed into something solid, something that stopped it cold. The world went silent. The moment the car crashed, everything went silent. The growling stopped. The fog around me cleared, just enough for me to see the wreckage. My heart still raced, my breath shallow, my hands shaking uncontrollably on the wheel. I was alive, but I wasn't sure if I had truly escaped. I sat there for a long moment, the engine of the car idling, the fog lifting slowly like a blanket being pulled off me. The trees around me seemed to stand still, almost too still. The air felt heavy, like something was waiting, watching. The crash had knocked me back into my seat, but I wasn't hurt. I had no idea how I wasn't hurt. I should have been dead, but here I was, breathing. I wiped my face with my hands, the sweat mixing with the dirt and blood from the crash. I wasn't sure where it had come from. My face, my hands, everything felt sticky, like something had been pulling at me, clawing at me through the fog. It was a horrible feeling, like something had touched me but left no mark, only fear. I didn't know what I had been running from exactly, but I knew it wasn't over. It couldn't be. I slowly turned the key in the ignition again, not sure what I expected. But to my surprise, the engine turned over and the car sputtered to life. It wasn't running well, but it was enough to move. I gripped the wheel, my knuckles white as I carefully backed the car out of the trees. My hands were still trembling as I shifted the car into drive, my heart thudding in my chest. There was a part of me that wanted to drive back the way I came. I wanted to turn around, to leave, but something kept me going forward. I wasn't sure what it was, but the thought of stopping, of looking back at what I had just been through, terrified me more than anything. I kept my eyes straight ahead, the the road barely visible through the clearing fog. The forest around me was eerily silent. No animals, no wind, nothing. It felt as though the world had gone dead, as if everything I knew had simply disappeared. The headlights illuminated the path in front of me, but even the lights seemed to flicker. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching, that something was still there, just out of sight. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror. I was half expecting to see the shadowy figure again, the one that had followed me through the night, the one that had haunted my every step. But it was gone. The road was empty, nothing but the pale moonlight reflecting off the asphalt. Still, the feeling of being hunted lingered in my mind, gnawing at me. My hands felt slick with sweat as I gripped the steering wheel. It didn't make sense. I had seen that figure. I had heard it, felt it in my bones. It wasn't just some hallucination or a figment of my imagination. It had been real, and I had barely escaped with my life. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The road was endless, like it was leading me nowhere. There was nothing but darkness on either side, the trees closing in on me again, the weight of the silence pressing down on my shoulders. And then, through the fog, I saw it. A sign. A familiar sign. The exit to a town I recognized. It was only a few miles away. My heart leaped in my chest. I wasn't safe yet, but I was closer. As I pulled off the main road and onto the exit, I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my heart pounded again as I entered the town. It was quiet. Too quiet. There were no lights in the houses, no cars on the streets. It was as though the town had been abandoned. I parked the car at the first gas station I saw. I wasn't sure why I stopped there, but I needed a break. I needed to calm down. My fingers were still twitching, and I couldn't get rid of the pounding in my head. The noise inside my mind was deafening. I needed to get out of the car, to walk, to breathe. I stepped out of the car, the cold night air hitting my face like a slap. I looked around the gas station, half expecting someone to be there. But there was no one, just the faint hum of the neon lights and the quiet rustling of leaves in the wind. The hairs on my neck stood up again. It was too quiet, too empty. I walked over to the payphone. The strange emptiness of the place bothered me. I needed to call someone, anyone. I had to tell someone what happened, had to make sure I wasn't the only one who had seen what I saw, felt what I felt. But as I reached for the phone, I stopped. The thought of talking about it made me shiver. No one would believe me. I could already hear their laughter in my head. I could already see the way they would look at me, as though I was crazy. I let the phone drop back into its place. I turned back to the car, not wanting to think about the things I had just witnessed. I could feel it again, that oppressive weight on my chest, like something was looming over me. But I couldn't look back. I couldn't. I got back in the car and drove away. The town faded into the distance, but the feeling didn't. The terror, the sense that something was still following me, it never left. No matter how far I drove, no matter how fast, it would always be with me. I couldn't escape it. The darkness, the fog, the figure, they would always be a part of me. As I drove further into the night, I couldn't help but think about what had happened. It was impossible to forget. Impossible to pretend it had been just a bad dream. I had come too close to death, too close to something unnatural. I didn't know what that thing was, what it wanted, or why it had followed me. But I knew one thing for sure. I had been lucky to escape. And maybe, just maybe, I was meant to forget. But deep down, I knew the truth. The truth that would stay with me, always. Some things can never be fully escaped. Some things always find a way to follow you, no matter how far you run. And as the road stretched out before me, I couldn't help but wonder, what else was waiting for me out there in the darkness as the car rumbled on? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The events that had transpired on that road seemed to replay over and over in my mind, each detail more vivid than the last. The fog, the shadows, that feeling of being hunted, it was all still with me, clinging to me like a second skin. I had to stop. The road ahead stretched endlessly, and my mind felt like it was closing in on me. The fear I had felt was no longer just in the past. It was a part of me now, ingrained in my very thoughts. I needed to breathe, to ground myself, to find some shred of normality. Pulling over to the side of the road, I got out of the car. The air felt fresh, but it didn't help. It didn't clear the thick fog that still surrounded my thoughts. I leaned against the hood of my car, staring into the distance, trying to make sense of everything. Was I just imagining things? Had my mind been playing tricks on me after days of driving? After hours of being isolated, the logical side of me screamed that this couldn't be real, that it was just exhaustion and stress. But deep down, I knew better. The eerie feeling didn't fade. In fact, it grew stronger. The world around me seemed even more silent now, as if the universe itself had frozen in time. No birds, no animals, no wind, just an overwhelming silence that pressed on my ears. I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see something standing behind me. But there was nothing. I walked around the car, trying to distract myself, trying to shake the feeling. I reached the trunk and popped it open, only to find it empty. My things, my bag, everything was gone. I checked the back seat. No sign of my belongings. It made no sense. I had packed the car the night before. Everything had been in its place. Now, there was nothing. Just an empty, hollow car. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Was it some kind of trick? Had someone been inside the car while I was distracted? The thought made my stomach turn. But when I checked the door locks, everything seemed in place. They were still locked, secure. The panic began to rise in my chest again, the breath hitching in my throat. I slammed the trunk shut and looked around once more. The silence was unbearable, oppressive. I had to get out of there. I couldn't stay. I didn't know what was going on, but I had learned by now that staying in one place only invited more danger. I rushed back into the car, locked the door, and started the engine. The car hummed to life, the headlights casting shadows that seemed to dance along the road in front of me. The moment I started driving again, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The sense of being followed, being watched, it was back. It crept into my thoughts like a shadow, never leaving, never giving me a moment of peace. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, but each time, there was nothing there. Just empty road and the same barren landscape that had been with me for miles. But that didn't make me feel safe. It made me feel worse. It made me feel like something or someone was lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. I couldn't do it. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. The road stretched out ahead, winding and twisting as it led me into more unfamiliar territory. The headlights flickered again, just like they had before. For a moment, I wondered if it was just a malfunction, a simple glitch. But no. It was more than that. It was the same flickering I had seen when the figure first appeared in the fog. That same unsettling feeling crawled up my spine. The connection was too real to ignore now. I slammed my foot on the gas, urging the car to go faster. I didn't know what I was running from, but I could feel it in my bones. It was close, closer than ever before. My heart pounded, my hands gripping the wheel until my knuckles turned white. The car seemed to speed up, the world outside becoming a blur of lights and shadows. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the headlights flickered again. But this time, they didn't go back on. The car stalled, sputtering and shaking as I struggled to keep control of it. The engine died with a final, sickening groan. I slammed my hands on the steering wheel in frustration. No, 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 I muttered, trying to start the car again. But it wouldn't budge. The engine was dead. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere, no phone signal, no other cars around. And worst of all, that same oppressive silence was back, wrapping itself around me like a suffocating blanket. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I sat there in the dark, the only sound the faint hum of the dying car and my frantic breathing. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. My mind was racing, my body frozen in place. Something was out there. I could feel it. Just when I thought I might lose my mind, I saw it. A figure, in the distance. It wasn't the same as before, not the shadow I had seen earlier. This one was clearer, more solid. A man, walking slowly towards the car. His figure seemed to shimmer, as though he was part of the fog itself. His face was blurred, impossible to make out, but I knew he was coming for me. I had no choice. I had to move. I wasn't going to wait around to see what he wanted. I grabbed the door handle, my breath caught in my throat, and I threw open the door, stumbling out of the car and running into the night. The forest around me seemed to close in as I ran, the branches of the trees reaching out like twisted arms, clawing at my skin. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, and I stumbled, falling to the dirt. My breath was ragged, my chest tight with panic. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know where I was, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't turn back. The figure was closer now. His footsteps echoed through the trees, slow and deliberate. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't afraid. And somehow, that was the most terrifying thing of all. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs aching, but I kept running. The sound of his footsteps grew louder, closer. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, pressing down like a physical force. I stumbled again, but this time, I didn't get back up. The ground was too soft, my body too weak. I turned to look back, and there he was, just a few feet away. His face was still hidden in the mist, but I could feel his presence. He was close enough to touch. And then, just as I thought my heart would stop, he spoke. "You can't run forever." His voice was calm, almost gentle, and yet it sent a chill through my bones. I didn't understand what he meant, but it didn't matter. His words hung in the air like a warning, a promise. I wasn't sure what would happen next. I didn't know if I would survive. I didn't know if I'd ever be free from the terror that had followed me. But one thing was certain, this wasn't the end. Not yet. As the mist closed in around me, I couldn't help but feel that the nightmare would never truly be over. It would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to slip up. And it would find me, no matter how far I ran. I was never going to escape. As the story fades into the silence of the night, and the unsettling mystery lingers in your mind, take a moment to reflect on what you've just experienced. Remember, sometimes the scariest stories aren't just told, they are felt. And you never really know what might be lurking just around the corner, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. If you found yourself captivated by these chilling tales, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-tingling stories. Join us in the next video because you never know, the next tale might just be about you. Stay safe, and always keep your eyes wide open because in the world of horror, anything can happen when you least expect it.